Everything you have been told about your brain and aging is incomplete. The studies that showed cognitive decline measured one very specific kind of intelligence: the speed of processing novel information. That kind does decline, measurably, from the mid-20s onward. The same studies measured a second kind of intelligence, and this is the part that rarely gets discussed. It was still rising in people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Still rising. The neuroscience has known about this for decades. And there is a finding from brain scans that reversed what neuroscience assumed about what the aging brain was doing. A pattern that looked like damage turned out to be an upgrade. There is also a finding from expertise research that shows what decades of engagement physically build: a form of perception so specific it only works within one domain and fails completely outside it. Both findings come later. The story the data tells has two directions running simultaneously, and most discussions of aging mention only one. In 1963, a psychologist named Raymond Cattell proposed a distinction that would take decades to be fully appreciated. Cattell had spent years studying intelligence testing, administering batteries of cognitive tasks to thousands of subjects across age ranges, and he noticed something in the data that the field's frameworks could not accommodate. The prevailing model of intelligence treated it as a single capacity. You had more of it or less of it, and aging meant having less. Cattell's data contradicted this. Performance on certain cognitive tasks declined steadily with age. Abstract reasoning, pattern completion in unfamiliar sequences, working memory under time pressure. Performance on other tasks showed a completely different trajectory. Vocabulary continued expanding, analogical reasoning drawn from experience improved, the ability to apply learned frameworks to new situations grew stronger and more refined well into the 7th and 8th decades of life. Same people, tested on the same day, performing worse on one battery and better on another. The decline was real. The improvement was equally real, and they were happening simultaneously in the same brain. Cattell's proposal was largely overshadowed for years by the deficit narrative, the assumption that aging meant losing cognitive capacity across the board. The studies that got attention were the studies that showed decline. The studies that showed improvement in crystallized measures were treated as a curiosity rather than as evidence of a fundamentally different process. It took decades of neuroimaging, the ability to see what the brain was actually doing during different kinds of tasks, to confirm that Cattell's two intelligences operated through genuinely different neural hardware, explained by different physics, running on different timescales. Cattell named them fluid intelligence, the ability to solve novel problems, detect patterns in unfamiliar data, hold multiple pieces of new information in working memory, and manipulate them rapidly. Crystallized intelligence, the accumulated knowledge, pattern recognition, and judgment built across decades of processing experience in specific domains. Simple enough as a distinction. But the physics underneath explains why the two move in opposite directions, and why the one that keeps rising may be the one that matters more for most of the problems a human life actually contains. Fluid intelligence depends on the prefrontal cortex and the raw speed of neural signal transmission, the bandwidth of the brain's processing pipeline. Signal speed along a myelinated axon runs at roughly 100 meters per second, the speed of a fast car on a motorway. Myelin, the fatty insulation sheath-wrapping nerve fibers, degrades with age through a gradual process. The oligodendrocytes that maintain the myelin sheaths become less efficient, producing thinner wrapping with more gaps. White matter integrity decreases roughly 5% per decade after 40, with the frontal lobes, the seat of working memory and executive function, declining earliest and fastest. As myelin thins, signal propagation slows. Along a well-myelinated axon, the signal jumps from node to node in rapid saltatory conduction, leaping across insulated segments the way electricity jumps along a wire. When the insulation degrades, the jumps slow and the signal must propagate continuously along unmyelinated patches, dropping from 100 meters per second to roughly 1 to 10 meters per second at those gaps. As signal speed decreases, the number of computational operations the prefrontal cortex can perform per second decreases with it, Worker memory capacity contracts because the system can cycle through fewer items before the first one fades from active holding. Processing speed drops because each neural computation takes longer to execute. This is the decline the standardized tests measure. It is real, it is physical, and it is the physics of signal degradation, the same physics that slows any transmission system when insulation erodes. A cable with damaged insulation transmits a slower, noisier signal. So does a neuron with thinning myelin, and every person who has noticed that they read a paragraph and cannot quite hold the beginning while reaching the end, or that mental arithmetic takes a beat longer than it did at 30, is experiencing this specific physics in their own working memory. Crystallized intelligence runs on entirely different hardware, and the hardware improves with use. Every time you learn something, the synapses involved in encoding that knowledge are physically modified. The physics of this modification is called Hebbian plasticity, and it operates through a specific electrochemical cascade. When two connected neurons fire simultaneously, when the presynaptic neuron sends a signal and the postsynaptic neuron responds, calcium ions flow through NMDA receptor channels in the postsynaptic membrane. The calcium influx triggers a molecular cascade that inserts additional AMPA receptors into the postsynaptic membrane. More AMPA receptors means the synapse responds more strongly to the same signal. The connection has been physically strengthened. Repeat the activation and the strengthening compounds. Over months and years, repeatedly activated synapses develop larger dendritic spines, denser receptor populations, and more reliable transmission. Well, this is the physics of learning made literal. Each repetition depositing another layer of molecular reinforcement on a connection, the way each coat of lacquer hardens a surface. A connection activated once is fragile. A single layer of AMPA receptors easily disrupted, the memory fading within hours if not reactivated. A connection activated 10 times is stronger, more receptor insertion, larger dendritic spine, more reliable transmission. A connection activated thousands of times across decades is among the most robust structures in the brain. A synapse so heavily reinforced that it fires reliably, rapidly, and with minimal metabolic cost because the pathway has been optimized by 40 years of use. I keep coming back to that image. Decades of molecular reinforcement, layer by layer, until the connection is as durable as anything the brain contains. The physics of patience, and this is what crystallized intelligence is built from. Millions of these connections, strengthened across decades, forming associative networks so dense and so richly interconnected that pattern recognition operates through them almost automatically. When an experienced teacher reads a classroom and knows within seconds which student is struggling, that perception travels through a network built by 30 years of observing students. Hebbian connections reinforced by thousands of instances until the pattern arrives assembled without conscious effort. When a retired engineer looks at a design and senses something wrong before identifying the specific flaw, the sensing travels through a network built by decades of encountering designs that failed and designs that held, the pattern recognition operating through synaptic architecture that took a career to construct. Let that settle for a moment. The knowledge you carry in the domain where you have spent the most time, whether it is a profession, a craft, a relationship, a community, a body of knowledge you have returned to for decades. That knowledge is physically encoded in the most heavily reinforced synaptic connections in your brain. Those connections are denser, stronger, and more numerous than anything a 25-year-old brain contains in the same domain. The 25-year-old has faster signal propagation along fresher myelin. You have a richer network for the signals to propagate through, a network that took 40 years to build and that produces perceptions the faster brain cannot yet generate. The faster brain runs on fresher wiring, the older brain runs on richer architecture, and for most of the problems that actually matter in a human life. Problems that require judgment, context, pattern recognition drawn from experience. Architecture outperforms wiring. Now, there is something else happening in the aging brain that was misunderstood for years, and the correction changes the picture entirely. In 2002, Brain scans showed something that reversed a decade of assumptions about aging. Older adults performing cognitive tasks showed bilateral activation. Both hemispheres engaged simultaneously, where young adults showed activation in only one hemisphere. The researcher who documented this, Cheryl Grady at the University of Toronto, had expected to find a straightforward story. Aging brains working harder to achieve less, the neural equivalent of an old engine burning more fuel to produce less power. She compared activation patterns in young and older adults performing identical tasks: memory encoding, attention, pattern recognition. Young adults showed strongly lateralized activation. Older adults lit up both sides. Initial interpretation was straightforward and discouraging. The aging brain was compensating for damage. One hemisphere could no longer handle the task alone, so the brain recruited the other hemisphere as a backup, the way a person with an injured leg leans on a crutch. Compensation implied deficit. The bilateral pattern was read as evidence that something had broken. Grady's data told a different story. The older adults who showed the strongest bilateral activation performed best on the tasks, better than older adults who maintained the lateralized pattern. If bilateral activation was simply compensation for damage, the most damaged brains would show the most bilateral activity and perform worst. The opposite was true. The brains using both hemispheres were performing better, and the bilateral engagement correlated with cognitive reserve, education, and lifetime intellectual engagement. The brains that had been used most intensively across the most years showed the most bilateral recruitment and the best performance. Grady's finding overturned a decade of assumptions. Every previous study that had observed bilateral activation in older adults had interpreted it through the deficit lens. More activation means more effort. More effort means the task is harder for the aging brain. Therefore, bilateral activation equals decline. Grady's contribution was to measure performance alongside activation and discover that the relationship ran the opposite direction. More bilateral activation predicted better performance. The brains that looked on the scan like they were working hardest were the brains that performed best. The additional recruitment was productive, and it was most productive in the brains with the richest history of cognitive engagement. That is worth pausing on. The pattern everyone assumed was damage was predicting better performance. Roberta Cabeza formalized this as the Herald model: hemispheric asymmetry reduction in older adults. The model proposes that bilateral activation in aging brains represents a processing strategy, a way of bringing more cortical area to bear on each computation. The aging brain draws on broader networks, integrates information across more regions simultaneously, and processes experience through a wider aperture than the lateralized young brain. You may have noticed this shift in yourself without having a name for it. In your 20s and 30s, you made decisions quickly. You saw the answer, you committed, you moved. The speed felt like competence. In your 50s and 60s, the same kind of decision started taking longer. More factors surfaced, more considerations competed for attention. More of what you had learned across decades insisted on being weighed before the answer emerged. The slowing felt from inside, like something had been lost. The bilateral research suggests the opposite. The brain was recruiting more cortical territory per decision, drawing on both hemispheres where it had previously used one, integrating more stored experience into each computation. The answer took longer because the answer was drawing on more. The slowness was width. Practically, this changes which problems the aging brain is suited to solve. The decisions that define the second half of a life are overwhelmingly decisions that reward the wider aperture, decisions where speed is a liability because speed forecloses the integration that the problem requires. The bilateral aging brain, bringing both hemispheres to the computation, weighing more factors simultaneously, is architecturally matched to exactly the kind of problem that matters most in a life that has accumulated enough experience to recognize complexity when it appears. Wider aperture sacrifices speed. Routing through more territory takes more time. It gains integration. More cortical area contributing to each computation means more context being incorporated. more associations being activated, more competing factors being weighed simultaneously. For a decision that requires speed and a narrow focus, the lateralized young brain outperforms. For a decision that requires weighing multiple factors simultaneously, a medical diagnosis with ambiguous symptoms, a personnel decision with competing considerations, a financial judgment where the obvious answer has hidden risks, a family situation where the right response depends on decades of knowing the people involved, the bilateral aging brain brings more of itself to the problem than the young brain can. This is the neural basis of what people call wisdom, and it has been measured. Older adults performing judgment tasks that require integrating conflicting information show bilateral activation patterns that correlate with better outcomes. The wider the recruitment, the more factors are weighed, and the more nuanced the judgment that emerges. The 25-year-old brain makes faster decisions. The 65-year-old brain makes decisions that account for more of the complexity the situation actually contains. That finding changed how I understand what the aging brain is actually doing. The brain at 65 is using more of itself per task. The additional recruitment produces slower processing and richer integration simultaneously. For tasks that reward speed, timed tests, rapid pattern matching, video games, the lateralized young brain outperforms. For tasks that reward judgment, complex decisions with incomplete information, situations where context matters more than reaction time, problems where the right answer depends on weighing factors that take decades of experience to learn to perceive. The bilateral aging brain has an architectural advantage the young brain cannot match. And the broader integration connects to one more network, the default mode network, the regions active during rest and reflection. What matters for the aging brain is a specific finding. In older adults, this network is more robustly connected and more efficiently integrated than in younger adults. The network has more to work with, more encoded experience, more associative connections, more patterns built across a longer life, and it has developed the infrastructure to integrate that material efficiently. The older brain spends more time in this integrative mode, and the time it spends there is productive in ways that no standardized test captures. The tendency toward reflection, toward considering more before speaking, toward connecting a current situation to something that happened 20 years ago, toward sensing that something about a proposal feels wrong before being able to articulate exactly what. This is the default mode network operating on a richer data set than it has ever had access to. The reflection that looks from the outside like a person staring out a window is often the most computationally intensive processing the brain performs, integrating decades of stored experience into a coherent assessment of whatever the current situation requires. That pause before answering a question, the one that feels, from the outside, like slowness, is often the default mode network cross-referencing the question against decades of stored context. The younger brain answers faster because it has less to cross-reference. The older brain answers more slowly because the network has more material to integrate and the integration produces a more considered response. Speed and depth again. The same trade-off, running through different neural hardware, producing different qualities of output. You have felt this. You have sat in a meeting where a younger colleague gave the quick answer and you hesitated. And an hour later, you realized your hesitation contained something important, something the quick answer missed, something that took your default mode network longer to surface because it was drawing on a larger store of relevant experience. The hesitation was integration. The delay was depth. And the quality of what emerged, when it finally emerged, reflected 40 years of pattern that the quick answer could not access. Now, the expertise research deepens this further, because it shows what decades of deliberate engagement physically build in the brain's pattern recognition architecture. Anders Ericsson spent his career studying expert performance across domains, and his finding that expertise requires roughly 10,000 hours of deliberate practice became widely known. Less discussed is what those hours physically do to neural architecture, because the change is structural and permanent in a way that most discussions of expertise do not convey. Expert brains process information in fundamentally different units than novice brains. A chess master looking at a board configuration does not see individual pieces on individual squares. They see integrated patterns, whole configurations recognized as single units, the way you recognize a face as a whole, rather than assembling it from individual features. When researchers showed chess masters a board position from a real game for 5 seconds and then asked them to reconstruct it, masters reproduced it almost perfectly, placing 20 or more pieces correctly. Novices could place 5 or 6. The difference was striking, but the control condition was what made it significant. When the pieces were arranged randomly rather than in a configuration from a real game, masters performed no better than novices. Both groups placed 5 or 6 pieces from random arrangements. The master's advantage operated only on meaningful patterns, configurations they had seen thousands of times across decades of play. Their brains had compressed those patterns into retrievable chunks, and the chunks were what they perceived and what they remembered. The random arrangement bypassed the chunking architecture entirely, and without it, the master's memory was no better than the novice's. What this reveals about expertise is profound. It is pattern recognition architecture, Hebbian assemblies built by repeated exposure to meaningful configurations until those configurations fire as single retrievable units. The architecture only operates on patterns within its domain. Outside the domain, the expert is a novice. Inside it, the expert perceives a different world, one organized into larger, richer, more meaningful units than anyone without the architecture can see. A physician with 40 years of experience processes a patient presentation the same way. The symptom cluster arrives already assembled, the diagnosis emerging from pattern recognition rather than effortful analysis, the way reading a word happens as a single act rather than a sequence of letter recognitions. The medical student works through the differentials systematically, holding each possibility in working memory, evaluating evidence against criteria. The experienced physician's network delivers the pattern before the systematic analysis begins. Because the Hebbian assemblies built by 40 years of seeing patients fire as units, the co-activated neurons producing a stable, recognizable output in milliseconds. Information compression is the physics underneath expertise. A novice, processing a chess position, must hold each piece and its relationships in working memory individually. 20, 30, 40 separate items, taxing a working memory system that can hold roughly 7. An expert has compressed those individual items into chunks. Integrated patterns stored as single retrievable units in long-term memory. The expert holds fewer items in working memory because each item contains more information. The compression is built by repeated exposure to meaningful groupings. Hebbian strengthening of co-activated neurons, producing stable assemblies that fire as units. The assemblies take years to build, because the patterns they encode take years of experience to encounter often enough for the synaptic reinforcement to reach stability. Compression does not reverse with age. The chunks remain. The pattern recognition architecture remains. The expert's ability to see meaningful wholes where novices see disconnected parts continues operating even as fluid processing speed declines around it. A 70-year-old physician, a 70-year-old teacher, a 70-year-old engineer, a 70-year-old who has spent 40 years navigating the same community and the same set of human relationships. Each carries neural architecture built by decades of deliberate engagement, operating through the most heavily reinforced synaptic networks in their brain, producing a form of intelligence that no amount of raw processing speed can replicate. Every viewer watching this has built expertise in something, in their profession, in their craft, in the specific landscape of their own life. The knowledge encoded in those Hebbian networks is the most physically durable structure in their brain, precisely because it has been reinforced the most. The younger person who processes faster does not see what the older expert sees, because the patterns the expert perceives took decades of exposure to stabilize into recognizable chunks. Speed built none of those patterns. Time built all of them. Honesty requires naming what does decline, because the full picture includes both directions and a half-truth in either direction serves no one. Processing speed declines measurably from the mid-20s. The myelin physics drives this: thinner insulation, slower conduction, fewer computational cycles per second in the prefrontal cortex. Working memory capacity contracts. The system that holds items in active manipulation operates on a slower clock, and items fade from the buffer before the system can cycle back to refresh them. The ability to rapidly switch between competing tasks diminishes. Task switching requires the prefrontal cortex to reconfigure its activation pattern, and the reconfiguration takes longer with degraded signal speed. Under time pressure, with novel information and conditions that demand raw computational throughput on unfamiliar material, older brains perform less well than younger brains. These are real, measurable, consequential changes. They are the part of the story that gets told. And the reason they dominate the narrative is the instruments that produced it. They get told because the tests were designed to measure them. The standardized intelligence tests that produced the decline narrative were built in the early 20th century, when psychologists treated fluid intelligence, speed, novel pattern detection, working memory, as the core of cognitive ability. The tests that measure crystallized intelligence, vocabulary depth, analogical reasoning from experience, judgment in domain-specific contexts, were treated as measures of education rather than intelligence. Cattell's insight, proposed 60 years ago and confirmed by every decade of neuroimaging since, was that both are intelligence, both are real, both are measurable, and they move in different directions with age. The culture inherited the tests and the narrative those tests produced, decline, without inheriting the second half of Cattell's finding. The story you have been told about your aging brain was told by instruments designed to measure only one of the two things happening inside it. You see, there is a reason this matters beyond reassurance. Every time a society makes decisions based on the assumption that older minds are declining minds, in hiring, in retirement policy, in medical decision-making, in the casual dismissal of an older person's judgment, those decisions are based on a measurement of one kind of intelligence applied to problems that require the other kind. The test says the 65-year-old is slower. The Hebbian network, the bilateral integration, and the default mode infrastructure say the 65-year-old is seeing more. Both measurements are accurate. The question is, which one is being applied to the right problem? Raymond Cattell described two kinds of intelligence 60 years ago. One rises fast and declines from the 20s. It runs on myelin and processing speed. The other builds slowly across a lifetime, runs on synaptic reinforcement and network density, and keeps rising when the first has already been falling for 40 years. The speed declines, the knowledge deepens, the processing narrows, the judgment broadens. Both are true in every brain at every age past 30, and the balance between them shifts as the decades accumulate. The things the brain loses are real. The things it gains are equally real, and they are the things that take the longest to build. A brain at 65 is something that took 65 years to build. 65 years of Hebbian reinforcement, of associative network construction, of pattern recognition refined by tens of thousands of encounters with the material of a specific life. The myelin is thinner. The networks are richer. The processing is slower. The judgment is deeper. And the most important things that brain can do now are things it could not have done sooner, because the architecture that produces them required every one of those years to construct.